when we're actually in our substance use or our addiction, right, we're many times defined by labels people use about us, with us, right? So over time, what can happen is those labels do influence us. And most people in active use actually react in one of two ways. They take on the label and that becomes their identity, right? Sometimes we love it. Sometimes we're like, yeah, I am crazy. You're right. I am a whore. I'm going to live it up, right? And then sometimes it's, right? And then sometimes it's, we do everything to avoid it, right? We do everything to avoid that label. And so, and the truth is not everybody's addiction lives out loud. Some people have whole other like dual lives they're living. And then one side of their life, they're really enjoying the fruits of some of their labors while they're also being, crushed by the guilt of understanding that there's this whole other life. And then the fear of that being found out, right? So I want to acknowledge that because I was one of those people, everybody knew I was a train wreck, but I've worked with a lot of people who had these very compartmentalized periods of their life. Recovery came sometimes because they recognize that, and sometimes because that compartmentalized life, the top got popped off of it and it came blowing out like a jack in the box, right? Sometimes to other people's surprise. So when we find recovery, and I said, we find recovery, what a blessing. I said, maybe for some people. I recognize that not everybody who gets in recovery is joyful about that experience. And I recognize that some people are on different levels of the spectrum of acceptance or understanding or gratitude about that, right? But the truth about taking on labels in recovery is that it's important. It's an important pathway to freedom. How many of y'all found relief when you assumed the alcoholic addict label and it was something that you did as an identification piece so that as a surrender piece? A lot of people find freedom in that. Some people don't, and that's okay. When I'm working in therapy with people, I don't use those labels. I let people use whatever labels fit for them, but I keep it real general because I don't assume anything. But using learning to have an accurate understanding of our problem helps us have an accurate understanding of the potential solutions that are available to us, right? That's the whole premise of understanding the obsession and the allergy, is that when we understand that, it rightfully delivers us to a solution that can help us find freedom. So in that way, our substance use and addiction was once our identity, and then recovery kind of becomes our new identity. When you think about yourself and your recovery identity, what are some of the things you think of? Okay. So you see that recovery becomes its own identity, right? Like it's a counter identity. And I think it's important to understand that these two factors converge, right? Under this concept. One is we have this gratitude for this thing that saved us, that helped save us, right? We feel grateful and almost indebted. And this is that concept of not pouring from an empty cup, right? We get filled with gratitude and that gratitude flows over in service. And there's the other piece of it where we learn that there's a culture of not saying no. How many of y'all have been taught you don't say no to AA or NA? Right? Yeah. Everybody's like, oh, this is an uncomfortable one. Yeah, we've learned to say we don't say no to AA or NA, right? And I'm using 12-step recovery. If we have Al-Anon, Families Anonymous, other folks in here as well, it's the same culture, right? Like you express gratitude, you're of service. Another thing that happens, and Katie and I were talking about it before everybody got on, is like you get sober, you get into recovery, and then this FOMO, experience happens, right? This fear of missing out thing happens. And it doesn't matter if you're 18 or 88, you feel like you're not caught up to your peers. Like there's something you're missing. Like everybody else has had all these experiences, or need to catch up time with my kids or my grandkids. Or for me, it was like, everybody's finished college and here I am a burnout, and so this FOMO experience happens, right? And so we have this element where we have like, we're trying to drink from a high fire hose in AA or NA, and we're doing all this service, but then there's this piece where we're trying to cobble our life back together, on the other side. And so sometimes what it creates, right? Well, actually, I'm going to say this. In the early days, having some real concrete direction is very important. So I want to acknowledge this. We are pretty lawless when we find our way here, whether we've still got our jobs and our marriages and our kids, or whether we've lost everything. We're still anarchists at heart, right? You don't show up to a meeting room, joyfully sitting in that seat. You want to fight, and if you've ever been in treatment, you want to fight, right? They tell you to sit down, you want to stand up. You turn left, turn right. Yeah, I'm 46 and almost 24 years sober. And I still want to fight. That's a part of I just do think it's a part of my core personality, and that's okay. It's a piece that I've peeled back over time. But I needed concrete steps. I needed somebody to say, wake up, hit your knees, make your bed, go to a meeting, call your sponsor, build a network, do the opposite of what you've done before, do the opposite of what your instinct is to do, right? These are all things that saved me in the early days. Get some sleep, wash, rinse, repeat. And these are great foundational pieces. We need these pieces for the foundational pieces. But what I want to peel back to is that there's this whole emotional undercurrent that most of us don't tap into until we've gotten really burned out. Like what David was talking about, that process where we have to peel it back because there's so many things that are driving it for us, right? Excitement, awe, wonder. Do you remember when you first started hearing birds chirp and they didn't annoy you? Or when you could see the clouds and they seemed so vibrant? I mean, I still look at the clouds, like the sky today. I'm like, has the sky always been this beautiful? Sometimes I look at it and I go, I don't remember it being this beautiful before, And so we have this amazing breadth of emotions and wonder that open up to us. But then we also have guilt, we have shame, we have remorse, right? We also have the desire to be validated, to be desired, to be needed. These are all human desires and needs. And some of us get caught up on these really superficial pieces. So I was laughing with a couple of people before everybody got on, and we were talking about, you see them sometimes still on Facebook, but in the MySpace days when everybody did all the surveys, right? Or even in the early days of Facebook where everybody did surveys, it was like, what was your favorite color? And David will probably remember this, but I had a roommate that we were roommates for 4 years. We were roommates for so long, everybody thought we had a secret that we weren't telling people, and it wasn't, so. And even still, when we moved out, we moved next door to each other for another 2 years after that. And but this roommate, I can remember her doing one of these MySpace surveys, and she had this crisis. She was like, I don't know what my favorite color is. I don't know what my favorite color is. I can't tell you what's my favorite album of all time. I couldn't even list the top 10. And they're not even in the same genre. She was having this crisis, right? Of who am I? And I was like, those things don't matter. You know what? My kids laugh at me because one day my favorite color is green and some next day it might be purple. One day we're listening to Sturgill Simpson and the next day we're listening to Beastie Boys, we're all over the place. I told Katie, I was like, sometimes if I lose cool points in the car for listening to Encanto and Teen Beach Movie music, then that's going out the window. But that gets played in the car too. And so one of the things that I do a lot of work training peer supports. And this is one of the things we challenge the peer support specialists that are getting trained and going out into the world to do peer support with, is that we have these underlying needs, and they're basic needs. I could go into the therapeutic concept of polyvagal theory or, attachment theory, where if we didn't have our needs met, we might be anxious, we might be avoidant, we might be insecure, and I'm not going to get into all that. What I'm going to say is we have these underlying needs that are basic needs. And if you've ever been in a relationship with a partner, and then another relationship with a partner, and another relationship with a partner. And the thing that you feel like shows up in every relationship, that's your underlying need, right? And so we're going to talk about a little bit what that might look like. So here's a list of them, and I'm going to give them, and I laugh because some people are like, damn, I'm all of those things. And what I'll say is that, a couple of these I feel like are the superficial paths, and some of these are the underlying paths. But one of the needs that people struggle with is to be liked, right? Like, people want to be liked for the most part. Most people want to be liked, right? We struggle to be seen in a negative light. And I always tell everybody, we had this friend, Ed Mutum, and he passed away a few years ago, but he was a big circuit speaker. And he used to talk about how, like, you get, the 200 to 1 principle, you get 200 compliments and 1 criticism, and all you can focus on is that 1 criticism, right? So we struggle with the need to be liked. And then we have the need for perfectionism, right? Perfectionism isn't necessarily about the outcome, it's about the process. And so I always tell everybody, it's the person who will not write a 4th step in anything but black ink, because it says in the big book, we set it on paper in black and white, right? That's perfectionism. Okay. And y'all, there's treatment centers that actually make people go back and write their 4 steps in black ink for that purpose. Like, it really does happen. Here's a big one for me: to be seen as helpful. Being seen as helpful is different than being liked, right? And I used to, like, people would say everybody struggles with being liked, and I'd go, I have if you know me personally, I'm a social justice warrior. If there's something that I feel like very passionately tied to, and I think it's important, I will fight on that. I will fight for that thing, to the exclusion of being liked, because, I joke and tell people God gave me a stronger sense of justice than he did a sense of self-preservation, right? And so, but being seen as helpful. And so, David, I laughed at what you said, because I've even had to peel back my last burnout phase. I had to peel back I don't have the answer, but I can help you find it, right? Because for a long time, I was the person that would help people find the answer. And then if I couldn't find it, or I would try to be the answer. And then when I couldn't do that, I would try to help people find it. And I had a revolutionary experience today doing supervision with a local peer support agency, where the woman was like, can you talk to this mom for me? And I said, no, I can offer you the resources to pass along to her, because there was once upon a time I've been like, yeah, I'd be happy to talk to her. And the next thing I know, I was strapped this mom to my back and carrying her like everybody else does, right? And so I have to be really cautious about that. So being seen as helpful is a big one for me. Social relationships. How does social relationships show up? It's you get really enmeshed with people, right? You're not authentic about who you are because you care about the social. You get over involved and over invested in people. Then there's status or prestige. I laugh about this one, y'all. There's a guy. Okay, it's not always a guy, but it's generally a guy. At many home groups, it sits at the front, has like triple digit years. I'm just kidding. And literally waits until everybody's done talking, and then they share about everybody's share, and they correct, if you quoted it the wrong page, or if you misspoke it, or it's the person who really struggles. Like they like status and prestige, but they very, very rarely actually have meaningful relationships. They don't have a lot of people around them because they're always competing with people. So people don't want to be around them. They struggle to be in relationship with them. So they tend to have a lot of new people around them for short periods of time, and then those people cycle out. That's status and prestige. But then control, and control really is about like trying to control the outcome, right? It's like controlling the whole process. And I laugh because if any of my people here are from Charleston, there's a couple of sponsorship groups in Charleston that these are great examples. Like there's 5 layers of sponsorship. Everybody sponsors the same way. You're part of, or you're apart from, like you're in this group or you're not in it, and it's like And if the grand sponsor doesn't like something a grand sponsee is doing, they'll come in, call them out. It's like this real culture. And these are really good for newcomers, but these networks of these controlling networks can get actually really dangerous because people feel ousted, right? They feel socially isolated. They feel rejected if they don't do what they are expected to do, right? This can also look like telling somebody what their character defects and what amends they need to make, when you're doing their step work with them. Okay. So everybody kind of clear on the differences between these? Did any of these ring a bell for any of y'all? I will say this: once upon a time, control is my thing, and I've peeled it back, and it's really the being helpful piece is the piece that I like. That is really more of the deep piece, right? So when I was looking at control and I realized I had some controlling elements, I really thought it was about being liked or being fearful about not being liked, and that wasn't it at all. I wanted to be effective and helpful. It's important to understand that peeling these things back, like we see for a lot of people, they see patterns of behavior when they do their first 4-step or when they do a 4-step, right? Like, you start to see patterns. That's why it says, we talk about the exact nature of our wrongs. We don't rehash all of our life details with our sponsor in our 5th step. I mean, some people do, but for the most part, for a lot of people, it really is about, the exact nature of your wrongs, which is some of these things. And so you're right. And some people, sometimes these things get missed. Sometimes we don't see them for years. Sometimes we think they're beneficial. They have more rewards than they have detriments. Like, there's a lot of reasons why we won't uncover them, but I like to talk about them because I think that it's important to understand when we're talking about this, when we think about like our potential outcomes, when we're driven by our needs and we don't have perspective on them, there's no clarity. Right. And so what happens is we're externally motivated. So it drives dissatisfaction and conflict in our life. Right. Because we're constantly misunderstood, especially if we don't have awareness about it. We're constantly misunderstood because we don't have awareness about it, which is why I said sometimes these are the things we see repeated through relationships. And it's not just our romantic relationships. It can be other relationships where intimacy exists. And we can't be vulnerable because we're not clear about our needs, right? We're not clear about how we're showing up or what we're showing up, And I laugh because I'm like Brene Brown. I see shame in everything, right? But I laugh. So, but then when we have an understanding of our needs, it offers clarity, right? And so what it can do is we can wrestle with humility, exactly who and what we are, and then it can expand satisfaction and connection in our life. And I'm actually going to don't laugh at my terrible whiteboard skills, okay? Y'all hear me? Promise not to laugh at my terrible whiteboard skills, because I'm going to actually just try to draw. Everybody can see this whiteboard? So I'm going to use it like this. What happens when we have these underlying needs? And y'all, there's more than those, but those are the big ones, right? So we have these underlying needs, and that is the thing that drives our life, right? So here's us. Here's our, family. I like how good I draw with my mouse. Yeah. Family, other people, right? Other people, or if you're old school, it's OPP. Anybody get my jokes? All right, there you go. So, and then, what happens is ideally what we do is we learn to identify our priorities and our values, because when we identify our priorities and our values, those become the thing that our life is surrounded by. The reason why I say that is when we have this underlying need, if it's being met, then we're down here in the tank, right? And everybody in our life is where? Down here in the tank with us. And when needs are being met, right? The underlying need is being met, and we're here, and everybody in the tank is up here with us. When we have these priorities and values, I can't do any better. Then we have us and our family and our OPs and anybody else in our life, right? And then if we're clear on our priorities and values, what happens is, y'all, we're not going to get totally clear on all of those things tonight. It's understanding the value of having clarity about your needs, because when you have clarity about your needs and they're not driving the bus, you have clarity on what your priorities and values are, then what happens is you're not up and down based on whether your needs are being met or not. You're clear about what your underlying needs are, how they can drive you negatively or disconnect you from people in your world, and how do you stay normed around your priorities. And the reason why I say this, and that's I'm using really intellectual terms, I'm sorry, I'm a therapist, so sometimes I struggle with that, if we're going to be honest. But what I want everybody to understand is that we can only grow where we're planted, right? We can only, so going back to thinking of ourselves not as what we wish we would be, but as we are, wrestling with these truths about ourselves actually gives us clarity and allows us to expand satisfaction in our life and connection in our life, because we're tied to something that has substance, and that's our values and priorities, versus something that feels like it's kind of all over the place. And so ideally we start here, and over time we kind of grow, but then again, this is from Ed Needham. Ed Needham did a lot of talks about forgiveness, and he talked about, like, we can only forgive somebody if we're honest about where we are with them, right? We only forgive ourselves when we're honest about where we are with things. We can only offer self-compassion when we suffer ourselves with humility. And so it's that piece. And so here's a real quick exercise I'm going to do. And this is why I said this will sometimes leaving you with more questions, right, than answers. And there's a number of ways you can do this exercise, but I'm going to keep it simple and say, what I want everybody to think about is your life today as it stands, right? Think about your life today as it stands. What are the priorities you have in your life? So I want everybody to think about this, not what you want it to be. Like, what, if you think about your average day, what takes your time and attention? So for me, time and attention, my kids, no doubt, right? My marriage is one. My recovery, right? My work. I'd like to say my self-care. I've actually learned to build in self-care every day in some way, shape, or form, right? I give myself quiet space or space to, to breathe a little bit every day. I had to get to the point where I could not function, could not get out of bed. I was so burnt out. I literally could not get out of bed. I had to quit working for a while because I was so burnt out. So when I talk about this topic, I'm passionately tied to it, because I know not getting on top of this stuff means, like, it can mean the death of your soul, for real. What else? Oh yeah, social networks, right? And some people would say that's a part of their, but social connections. How many of y'all, I'm going to say this, and I don't want, like, I'm not touching on this to hit nerves for anybody, but how many people are still driven by, they still have a lot of shame that takes up their time, a lot of anguish, trying to manage triggers for mental health or mental health or trauma, right? We're talking about mental space too, right? Not just your physical space, but things that take up your mental space, right? When we go through trauma, our central nervous system is impacted. It impacts our emotional memory. And so anything in the future that feels like that, including and especially things that actually are that real trauma, with that person. And some of us are in family situations where we can't avoid it. Some of us are in social situations where we can't avoid it, and stuff like that. And that system, the central nervous system activation is real. And it's like, you have this piece where you get rocketed up into the emotional space, and then it takes time for it to come down. Now, I've been doing trauma counseling, working on my trauma recovery for since the day I got sober, and I can still get rocketed into that space and have to take time to come down. Now, the time it takes me to come down is quicker, and I'm not hyper vigilant or dissociated through the whole thing, right? But I'm very aware of when I rocket now that I'm there, and I can communicate with people that I'm activated in what I need to do to take care of myself. But once upon a time, I didn't have those skills. I get rocketed there, and then it was, a bomb blast with everybody around me, especially my intimate partner, who almost always can unintentionally be a trigger for that thing. So that's a very real space. And so when I talk about that, trauma recovery is a priority space, and one we have to give a lot of room for self-compassion with. One of the things to keep in mind is that when we're thinking about our life priorities, is not what we want them to be, it's what they actually are. And then what I want you to do is I actually want you to take a pie chart and look at the way these are distributed daily, right? Because a lot of times in our mind, if my kids, God bless them, if my kids are at the I say my kids are somewhere at the top of the list, but I go through the day, and especially before I got really burnt out and reevaluated all of my priorities and really put my energy towards the things that really are important to me. When I was saying yes to everything in the life, what I was doing is my kids were actually getting the smallest pie slice of the day. They were getting a little bit of time with me at the end of the day where I was tapped out, falling asleep, bitchy, yelling, not acting in a way that was congruent with how I wanted to be with my kids, right? Or with my husband, or my recovery wasn't getting the pieces. And so I think it's really important to say, what does it actually look like? What does my pie chart look like? So take a minute to kind of think about your pie chart, or write it out if you have a writing tool, because it's important. Some people will take offense to this. I don't mean for anybody to. I call Brene Brown Sister Brene because that's the status she has in my world. Like Sister Brene. Sister Brene has an exercise that she does, and or just a visual that she uses. She uses a lot of visual cues. And she talks about our life being a jar. Okay, our life is a jar. I don't know how many of y'all have heard this analogy, but she talks about our life is comprised of priorities, big priorities, which are big rocks, right? Smaller priorities, which are pebbles, and then filler things in our life, which is sand. And so what a lot of people do is they come into recovery and they're trying to make up for not putting their attention towards those big rocks, right? The rocks have never fit in the glass because the sand and the pebbles go in first, because our priorities are always out of line when we're substance using, right? But what happens is, with all the best intentions, we fill our glass with sand and pebbles still, because we're saying yes to all these things that are noble and even important, right? Yes to our recovery activities, yes to these things that bring us back to life. But we have to be honest about ourselves when we're not putting our rocks in the glass first. And so the whole point of this pie chart, I can ask you to list your priorities, and I can promise you this: I can list these priorities, and I can justify them and make them look like they're in my mind. I can rank order them how I want them to look, but I'll look at the pie chart. I can't lie to myself. When I think about the glass and whether the rocks are going in the glass first, I can't lie to myself, because the way my time is distributed is what tells me that truth, right? And I use this exercise because when I was finding myself in a place where I was saying, Shauna Nyquist is an author, and she says, we do brave, noble yeses, but with every yes, there's a no. And so for every yes I gave to somebody to do a commitment in AA, or every yes I gave to do a consulting gig, because recovery is important to me, not just recovery in the 12-step rooms, but developing capacity for recovery-oriented systems of care is a huge passionate project of mine. I've done some really cool projects in prisons and in the community and in a lot of places. I've done a lot of really cool things. I helped develop a whole framework for all the money that came down from the government a number of years ago. And that framework has gotten developed, right? That was really cool. And I had all these accolades, but I was coming home and I was giving no attention to the people who I brought into the world and who I chose to build a life with, my husband and my kids. Right. And that was starting to eat me up really bad. And so I had to look at my pie chart. So my challenge to you is, if your pie chart doesn't honestly look like you want it to, what's one thing you can tweak about it? Just one thing. We don't try to fix everything overnight. I'm not, as a nutrition coach, I don't expect anybody to change their, I'm like, let's just keep a food log for 2 weeks and get honest with ourselves about what we're doing. And if you're not drinking any water, let's just try to drink 30 ounces a day. Drink an 8-ounce glass before and after every meal, 3 times a day, right? That's a manageable change. So when we're looking at our life, what is a manageable shift, right? What's a manageable shift that you can dial? Y'all, I can't do these exercises. I could do 1,000 variations and deepen. I use this as a basic exercise with a lot of my clients in therapy, because I get a lot of people who come in, they're coming to me early in recovery or with a little bit of time under their belt, and their life is like 52 pickup because they got sober and they got excited and they said yes to a million things, and now they're trying to juggle a million things and they want to quit it all. Right? They want to quit it all. And so the thing about the pie chart is it's a reckoning for us to really say, this is how my life looks today, and how would I want it to look different, even if I just move the dial a little bit towards what I want it to look like. What does it look like to move it just a little bit? Well, and here's my thing about being sober. I had a sponsor, fortunately, early on, who said, you don't get sober to stay in AA for the rest of your life. And I say in AA in the meetings, but like my whole life is an AA today, right? Like it's a piece of my puzzle, but it's not my whole puzzle. Now, when I first came in, it was my whole puzzle, but I also didn't have kids. I didn't have all this other stuff that a lot of people have. So it's recognizing that staying sober is also keeping a commitment to priorities, because a lot of people drink over guilt for not showing up with their families, or find themselves in an affair with somebody in the rooms, right? Because they're not turning their attention to their home life, right? There's a lot of ways that like recovery gets sideways for people, recovery activities. And I say quote unquote, because we have this idea that there's this gold standard of recovery, and a lot of people find themselves drunk again trying to live up to that standard, when sometimes it's really about understanding that recovery might look different. Being sober might look different for different people. I have a friend who's 22 years sober. She still gets up and does a 7:30 meeting every morning, 7 days a week, because that is what makes her feel centered, right? I go to one meeting a week because that's what makes me feel centered. I have sponsees that I work with. I see them all, as needed, or I have one that needs to connect once a week. I meet with her once a week. I have one that likes to meet every other week. I meet her. Then I have other people who just touch base with me as needed. That's how I was as a sponsee, because I developed relationships with people fairly quickly. I have a really strong network. I've always had a sponsor that I can trust. If I can't trust my sponsor, I just don't, I wait until I have one I can. So it looks different for different people. And I think that's important to value. Not everybody needs to go to 5 meetings a week ever and forever and ever and ever. Amen. Some people need that, right? It's about getting honest with yourself about what that looks like for you. For some people, they weren't present with their family at all. And like balancing recovery activities with family activities is absolutely essential for them to be able to sustain their recovery and work through making amends to their families, right? Because like we talk about being sober, like it's this one and done experience for all people, but it's not. It really is comprised of the pie chart. Recovery activities give me the basis, right? My higher power for me gives me the basis, but it becomes the thing that's a part of my operating system. And so what I want everybody to understand is like people have to find their own, what we call recovery management plan, right? Sobriety takes on like how we support sobriety takes on new, different meanings for different people. And that's part of the pie chart. So the takeaway with this is, like, what do you do? For me, I have a bare minimum basic activities that keep me grounded in my program of recovery, keep me in the big book, keep me connected to AA, keep me connected to my early recovery story, all of that stuff. That's an important piece for me, and hopefully that's an important piece for other people. And Katie, I know we need to wrap. But so, what does it look like? And maybe that's a piece that needs to be bolstered for some people, but some people may feel real firm in that piece and need to really like turn their attention to other areas they want to take care of. So that's a reflection on the priorities piece. Sorry, I didn't go to that bit. The pie chart is where you go. I would love, a follow-up for this for me is there's a real good values clarification exercise you can do. If anybody's interested in it, you're more than welcome to email me. I can send you some stuff on it. But one of the things it does is it helps people identify values that they want to live by as well, and ways to make it congruent in their life, and that's another thing that helps people is being clear that if my value is courage, what does courage look like to me? What does it look like when I'm living in courage, and what does it look like when I'm moving away from courage? Right? If faith is a value for me, how do I move towards or away from that? What does it look like when I'm moving towards it or moving away from it? And who are the people that help protect that in my life? It's another piece, So, yeah. So this is ideally a piece where we start, like we cut the onion and we get to go peel it now. So the last thing we'll say is here's my contact information. Anybody wants to get in touch with me, you can follow our Cool Wellness on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. We're not active on LinkedIn or Twitter. We're there, but we're not active. And thank you for being with us. Appreciate that.